3.2, completing the square and the square root property. We're going to begin on page 81 with question number 2. Solve. Give the exact solutions. What in the world is an exact solution? Basically, it means no decimals. If you have radicals, they need to be written in simplest form. You can't have a radical in the denominator. If you have a fraction, again, the fraction has to be reduced and written in simplest form. So that is what an exact solution is. Essentially, you can't use your calculator to help you out. F, 3x minus 1 all squared equals 0. So let's solve this one. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And remember, if I'm taking the square root of x squared, that equals x. So the square root of 3x minus 1 all squared is equal to 3x minus 1. But it is going to be a plus or minus. Now let's say, for example, I have here x times x, that equals x squared, right? But I could also do negative x times negative x, and that equals x squared. So it could be positive x or negative x. In this case, I have plus or minus 3x minus 1, which equals 0. So let's start off with our positive. We have positive 3x minus 1 equals 0. And we are going to also do a negative, so we're just going to write it over here so I don't forget about it. So negative 3x minus 1 equals 0. Let's do our positive one first. So 3x minus 1 equals 0. 3x x equals 1/3. And we'll do the negative. So our answer is x equals 1/3. You don't write it as a decimal, you don't use your calculator, you leave it as a fraction. And I forgot to write down, this is 2f. 2j, x minus 2 all squared equals 8. Again, I'm going to square root this. So I get plus or minus x minus 2 equals plus or minus the root of 8. You just need the plus or minus on one side. So let's do our positive and our negative. So x minus 2 equals root 8. And we have to simplify root 8. And the negative version. Divide by -1 or times by -1. Again, we have to simplify the root 8. And there's our answers. If you look at them, they're very similar. So I can also write this a little more simply as plus or minus 2 root 2 plus 2. Do not use a calculator. This will be your exact answer. Question 3. Find the perfect square trinomial whose first two terms are given. So I have y squared minus 2y plus something. I'm going to be completing the square. So -2 divided by 2. Again, I'm taking my middle term. Divided by 2. That equals to -1. -1 squared equals 1. So that means this question mark should be 1. So it should be y squared minus 2y plus 1. And I can double check if I factor this. Two numbers that multiply to 1 that add to -2. And it's y minus 1 times y minus 1, which is the same as y minus 1 squared. So it is a perfect square. 4b, factor each perfect square trinomial. So let's factor this. Two numbers that multiply to 25. and add to -10. And I can rewrite this as y minus 5 squared. 5. Solve by factoring the perfect square trinomial. B. Y squared minus 4y plus 4 equals 9. Hold on a second. This is not equal to 0, so we're going to set this equal to 0 first. Move that 9 over. Two numbers that multiply to -5 and add to 4. That is not a perfect square trinomial, which is perfectly fine. We need to solve it, not simplify it. So I'm going to solve it, which means I need to find my zeros. So y minus 5 equals 0, or y plus 1 equals 0. So y is going to equal to 5, and y equals -1. 6. Solve the quadratic equation by completing the square. Use exact answers when possible. So we need to use the method completing the square to solve this, and no calculators allowed. F. Z squared plus 2z plus 7 equals 0. So z squared plus 2z I'm going to be including a number here. I have my 7 outside, and I'm going to be including a number there. This is equal to 0. I'm going to take my middle term inside the brackets. So the 2, divide that by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 squared equals 1. So I'm going to be adding a 1 inside. And since I've added a 1 to the equation, which means I changed it, I have to do the opposite and take it away as well. I can factor the stuff inside the brackets, and that should be a perfect square. Okay, so I have factored this using completing the square method, and they've asked me to solve it. So now I subtract 6 from both sides. Take the root of both sides. And I see a problem. Problem is this minus sign inside the root. You cannot take the root of a negative number. It does not work. So this does not exist. It is undefined. There is no answer. So if you have a question like this, you need to write down your answer is DNE, or does not exist, or undefined, so that everyone knows that you've finished the question. 6H. Again, we're going to solve this by completing the square. We first have to multiply it out. I'm going to move the 7 over. Doesn't seem to help me because that itself is not a perfect square. So let's complete the square. -2 divided by 2 equals -1. -1 squared equals 1. Let's factor. And now we're going to solve for y. Take the square root of both sides. Our positive answer. We need to simplify root 8. That's going to be 2 root 2. Add 1 to both sides. Our negative answer. So those are our two answers. We could also write our answer as y equals plus or minus 2 root 2 plus 1. Question 7. Solve the quadratic equation by completing the square. Use exact answers. F. 3x squared equals 6x plus 2. Let's move everything to one side. We're going to look at the first two terms, factor out a 3. Negative 2 divided by 2 equals negative 1. Negative 1 squared equals 1. So I'm going to be adding a 1 here. We've really added 3 times 1. 3 times 1, which is 3, so we have to subtract 3. Now let's factor what's inside the brackets. And we're going to solve this for x. Divide both sides by 3. Take the square root of both sides. You can't stop there because we have a square root in the denominator. So I'm going to separate this. So plus or minus root of 5 divided by root 3. We need to, it's called rationalizing the denominator. So I'm going to times this by root 3 over root 3. And I can do that because root 3 divided by root 3 equals 1. When I do that, I have plus or minus still. Root 5 times root 3 is root 15. Root 3 times root 3 is 3. Plus 1 equals x. So that's one way you can write the answer. I could also times the 1 by 3 over 3 to make it into a fraction. And if I do that, my answer will be this. Those are the same thing. And both are correct answers. 7h. Negative 9x squared plus 18x minus 3 equals 0. We need to complete the square, so let's factor out a negative 9. Negative 2 divided by 2 equals negative 1. Negative 1 squared equals 1, so we're going to add a 1 here. But in reality, we're doing a negative 9 times a 1, so we are adding a negative 9. Opposite of negative 9 is positive 9. And now let's factor what is inside the brackets. Now we're going to solve for x. Take the square root. Rationalize the denominator by timesing it by root 3 over root 3. Root 2 times root 3 is root 6. Root 3 times root 3 is 3. Again, we can leave it at that answer, or we could make that 1 into a fraction, so times the 1 by 3 over 3. And if that's the case, you can then add the two fractions together, and that would be your answer.